It's hard to say if anyone knew much ahead of time that the Avalon Hill Game Company, a firm of historic significance to the hobby of board gaming, would be gone before the end of the 1990s. In this video, we will explore the history, the people, and the games that comprise the final years of Avalon Hill, here on Legendary Tactics. The fall of the venerable Avalon Hill Game Company seemed to happen quite suddenly. Although there were some signs beforehand that society and the game markets were certainly changing, the company was changing too. 1992 was a year of significance in this regard. First of all, Thomas Shaw, at the time the vice president of the company, announced his retirement as of May of that year, at the age of 62. Shaw and Avalon Hill had become inseparable in the minds of many. His wife, Christy, was even the head of Avalon Hill's direct mail division from 1971 through 1981. He remains a figure of respect. One mark of that respect would be his election to the Wargaming Hall of Fame at Origins in 1977. Another would be his becoming the first chairman in 1980 of the new adventure game division of the Hobby Industry of America, HIA. Also, Don Hawthorne became the editor of the General in July 1992, with Volume 28, Number 1, replacing Rex Martin, who had helmed the General magazine for a decade, and had become affectionately known as Tyrannosaurus Rex. Martin had begun to work in helping design and playtest games, as well as beta testing some of the computer versions of the company's board games. Since he had a bunch of projects he wanted to work on, as well as admitting to some burnout, he figured it wasn't fair to the readership to continue as editor. The editorial change to Hawthorne was immediately noticeable, as the magazine format immediately changed to have a more modern look and feel. Also, in December of 1992, Jim Rose was hired to lead the computer game division. Though Avalon Hill had entered the computer game industry 12 years earlier, to that point the video game division of the company had struggled. Avalon Con 2 was held that year in Baltimore. Whereas the first one had been more about taking a sort of stand against the tide going out on war and simulation games, the second one was more about just having fun. Friends and attendant rivalries that had been established the year before were continued across various tournaments, featuring both new and old Avalon Hill games. Sadly, George Parrish Jr. passed away that year of lung cancer at age 62. He had illustrated a lot of board game box covers for Avalon Hill, like Russian Front, Britannia, Devil's Den, and Patton's Best. There is a touching message for him in the General, Volume 28, Number 2. There were a range of different types of games released in 1992. But first, a game that was not mentioned yet that came out in 1990. Red Barricades is a module for Advanced Squad Leader, the first official historical module that recreates the Battle of Stalingrad, focusing on the area around the Red Barricades Ordnance Factory. It features 7 scenarios that depict different sections of the historical battle and 3 campaign games. The campaign games are the core of this module, where players battle for control of factories and nearby buildings over several campaign days. Players reinforce their positions and continue the fight each day, covering either the early German assault, the last days of the Soviet defense, or the full 30-day German offensive. It also includes 2 maps that are based on the real battlefield, new terrain rules specific to Stalingrad, and additional weapons like the Russian Molotov projector. To play, the base ASL game and the Beyond Valor module are required. It is said that this is the best historical module that you can play in the ASL system. It is a true slugfest with lots of casualties, but is allegedly the pinnacle of this type of wargaming. Advanced Third Reich is the culmination of multiple rules revisions, variants, tweaks to the map board, and other refinements that had happened throughout the 1980s by enthusiastic fans in an attempt to perfect the game. Designer Bruce Harper improved the strength of armored attacks, adjusted how fleets interact with U-boats, and added a surrender level to Britain to allow for the possibility of a low-level surrender or negotiated peace with the Axis. It is not for the faint of heart, especially the rules that combine Third Reich with its sister game, Empire of the Rising Sun, to recreate the entire war on a global scale. This was later restarted as an online project named Global War 2000, which was eventually formally published by GMT Games as A World at War in 2003. For fans of the game, it is the ultimate endpoint of the evolution of the system. Around the same time, Avalanche Press even worked on a different version of the game, known as John Prados' Third Reich. It was designed by Brian L. Nipple and apparently resembles the original Third Reich more closely than it did the GMT version. Also in 1992, there was a computer version of Third Reich released. It appears to have been a good introduction to the game. That year, Computer Gaming World stated that the AI opponent offered a sufficient challenge for beginners and was a decent way to learn the game. It was apparently pretty good at finding the weak points in a player's strategy, but wasn't always great at exploiting them properly. Experienced players of the game were apparently better off playing it with other humans, however, if only by mail. Tyranno X is a game of prehistoric strategy where players try to herd and protect their group of dinosaurs from the environment and other dinosaurs by evolving them as best they can. The game is apparently a fun experience, although a player that gets off to a bad start will have a hard time catching up. It was originally published by Karl-Heinz Schmiel, who is well known for games like Die Macher, Was sticht, and Extra Blatt. He published it under his own banner, Mosquito Games, in 1990, and in 1992 Avalon Hill published the English version, which was also less cartoonish and added some educational descriptions of the creatures involved. In Gangsters, designed by Don Greenwood, players take the roles of bosses of organized crime families in Prohibition-era Chicago. Players fight over protection rackets, speakeasies, and gambling joints with their racketeers, thugs, and vamps, attempting to attract customers while keeping the coppers away. Each player's turn is timed, which keeps things fast-moving, and there are some fun props, like a water gun that's used to carry out a hit. There are multiple paths to victory, and in the 5-player version, one player has to take the side of the police, trying to accumulate money and loyal cops at the same time. In the September 1993 edition of Dragon, Alan Varney wrote that, "I don't like seeing criminals glamorized. That said, this design shows a charm and excitement independent of its subject. Enjoy this tasty fruit of Greenwood's long experience." Guadalcanal is included in the Smithsonian series, which generally dealt with remaking classic games from the early days of Avalon Hill, but this is not a remake. Guadalcanal shares only the name of its predecessor from the 1960s. In fact, this game has more in common with 2 other games, Flat Top and especially the Smithsonian edition of Midway. It deals with carrier warfare in and around the Solomon Islands, with land combat abstracted out of the gameplay. Scenarios include such famous battles as Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, and Santa Cruz. It is primarily designed for 2 players and works even better with a referee to enforce double-blind play. In addition, the General published an official expansion that included what-if scenarios for both Guadalcanal and Midway, including a fictional 1941 carrier engagement off the coast of Wake Island and an imaginary Japanese assault on the Panama Canal. The magazine provided the search board and counters required for play. While it is meant to be an introductory title, like the other Smithsonian titles before it, there are some valid questions as to its actual accessibility to new players. Gung Ho is the 9th module for Advanced Squad Leader, dealing with the nature of amphibious assault, and in the process introduces the US Marines and the Chinese Army. This is in addition to the new terrain such as ocean, beach obstacles, reefs, and seawalls, among other things. Then that same year saw the release of Croix de Guerre, the 10th module for Advanced Squad Leader. It brought in the French Army from 1939 to 1940 and Vichy French forces. It is meant to expand greatly on the French forces provided in Squad Leader's Crescendo of Doom. That said, it is a small module overall with a couple of maps, a few overlays, and some counters, but it fortunately offers some strong scenarios. Stonewall Jackson's Way is a simulation of the Second Manassas campaign and was the first volume in Avalon Hill's series of strategic Civil War games. This is one of the first Civil War games that recreated a whole campaign instead of just a single battle. It features 2 very accurate map boards of Central Virginia in the summer of 1862 that are based on original Civil War maps found in state and county archives, showcasing features like roads, turnpikes, railroads, rivers, mountains, bridges, and fords. Players control Union and Confederate military units, with each turn representing 1 day of real time. The game includes 5 basic scenarios, 2 advanced scenarios, and a detailed day-by-day historical analysis of the campaign. The interactive game system ensures unpredictable, exciting, and competitive gameplay, appealing to both Civil War enthusiasts and newcomers to this period of American history. It is designed to be fairly easy to learn and play, and to be fast playing. Some scenarios take less than an hour. Future games were designed to link up with the map of Stonewall Jackson's Way to help portray most of the Civil War's Eastern Theater. 1993 was a year that featured few new games, but they included some classics, and possibly the best Avalon Hill game of all time, at least according to the readership of the General. Avalon Con was held again that year at a new venue, the Hunt Valley Inn. Despite the fact that the sales manager who signed the contract had been transferred shortly afterwards, the catering manager resigned the week beforehand, the lighting was insufficient, and the pizza place was swamped throughout, attendance was up in 1993 and people reported having an excellent time. But sadly, all was not well. In the General, Volume 29, Number 3, Don Greenwood penned that issue's Avalon Hill philosophy article. In this piece, titled Change, he confronts the stark reality that board game sales are dwindling and that the younger generation has voted overwhelmingly with their entertainment dollars for the electronic media. In the age of Nintendo and Sega, seemingly no one can be bothered to read. Claiming that elements such as hubris and stubbornness were to blame, he said that the love of board games and the resultant narrow center of attention had allowed Avalon Hill to be bypassed by video games. Now a change in direction was necessary. The company had now begun to take digital games seriously. In fact, it was announced that video games were now going to be the main focus of Avalon Hill, with the first digital releases of Kingmaker and Operation Crusader to occur that same year, to be followed in short order by video game versions of Blackbeard, Advanced Civilization, Third Reich, and Fifth Fleet. To implement this change, Avalon Hill teamed up with Atomic Games, most famous for their V for Victory series. It was the end of an era, and while the company was not going to stop publishing board games, the reality was that they were going to have to be much more selective in their publishing going forward. So what board games were released that year? Assassin is a card game that has players moving around a map of Europe using cards to determine destination, method of transportation, and distance, scoring points for each port of call they reach. At the same time, other players drop hazard cards to block or slow their opponents down. One of the players is an assassin and gets bonus points for carrying out a hit on one of his or her opponents. The game is a revised version of a card game published in 1992 by FCB and Associates called Eurohit, and this game was picked up and subsequently published by Avalon Hill. The original game was criticized for its terrible components, but Dragon Magazine said that aside from that, it is a fun game. Designer Richard Berg disagreed, however. In his review, he said that the game is an exercise in boredom, with the description on the box being the most exciting thing about it. The rules revisions by Avalon Hill were also seen as problematic, with ambiguities that sometimes left players stranded between cities and provided too little player interaction. We the People is a seminal game that helped to launch a popular trend within wargaming, the card-driven game, popularly and colloquially known as the CDG. It simplifies traditional hex-based maps into an abstract system of connected spaces, known as point-to-point, for not only army movement and geography, but also to represent other elements like political affiliation and control. Additionally, instead of dice, a deck of battle cards is used to resolve conflicts, providing a more nuanced feel of combat and avoiding the randomness of die rolls. The game's dynamics are driven by strategy cards that represent historical Revolutionary War events, with each card serving multiple purposes depending on which side is playing it. The game was later reimagined in the quasi-remake Washington's War from 2010, which improved some aspects of the gameplay that had bothered players of We the People, specifically the challenge of overcoming occasional horrible hands of cards, the difficulty of playing the British side, and the grind of the game overall. Many people are surprised to find that it is, at its core, more of a political game than a war game as well, but at the end of the day, it remains a classic and important game. Breakout Normandy is a complex two-player wargame focusing on the Allied invasion of France during World War II. The game centers on the initial landings and breakout attempts. The German player aims to prevent a successful Allied landing and, if that fails, to contain the beachhead. The Allied player wins by establishing a beachhead or, ideally, as the title suggests, breaking out of it to the French countryside beyond. The map depicts the Normandy region where the initial amphibious operation took place, and the game's counters represent various military units, including infantry, airborne, armor, artillery, anti-tank, and anti-aircraft forces that took part in the historical invasion. It was the last of Courtney Allen's area impulse system utilized in Storm over Arnhem, Thunder at Casino, and Turning Point Stalingrad. While the rulebook is haphazardly organized, the game itself shone with tense, challenging, and interesting gameplay. It is arguably not very historical though, and though it is the acclaimed endpoint of the evolution of the game system, it admittedly has its limitations. Speaking of game systems, IDF, Israeli Defense Force, uses the same system as MBT to represent tactical combat in the Middle East from 1967 to 1973. The rule set was only adjusted in small ways to account for the difference in setting. It plays very similarly to its predecessor, with the exception that tank-on-tank battles are much more brutal, as it is set before the time of things like depleted uranium armor, for example. It is apparently a great game if one enjoys the system introduced by MBT. Kampfgruppe Piper 1 was the advanced squad leader module released that year. This is a module which recreates the fighting between US forces and the German SS during the Battle of the Bulge. It includes 2 historically accurate map sheets, a 4-scenario campaign game, and requires advanced squad leader in the expansions Beyond Valor and Yanks to play. Roadkill is the Mad Max movie franchise distilled into a board game. Players are in a post-apocalyptic cross-country race, where each vehicle is outfitted with things like machine guns, hand grenades, and tire slicers. The goal is to be the first to cross the finish line in one piece. A standard game includes 8 road segments and typically lasts about 2 hours, though shorter games are possible. The game involves strategy and passing other cars and dealing damage using weapons, which can reduce opponents' hand sizes or cause their cars to crash. Leading cars can create new road segments by passing an exit check, which becomes easier the longer they've been in the current segment and the fewer cars are trailing them. The card deck of 128 cards is versatile, being used for various game actions, including random number generation. The game can run long, but is apparently a lot of fun. Surprisingly, despite the abundance of weapons, the game may lack sufficient destruction for some players, who can use extra death rules to increase the carnage. While the gameplay is decent, the game's immersive theme and role-playing elements make it particularly appealing to those who enjoy thematic games. History of the World is, according to the ratings of the readers of the General, the highest-ranked game that Avalon Hill ever produced. There is no doubt that it is compelling. Up to 6 players compete as different empires over anywhere from 5 to 7 epochs, depending on the edition from ancient Sumerians to pre-World War I Germany. The game emphasizes that all empires rise and fall, and players score points based on the territories they conquer and how long their units remain on the board. Each epoch, players take control of a new empire, some more powerful than others. However, game mechanics help balance the gameplay. Players expand their empire by conquering adjacent territories, and battles are resolved through die rolls, with modifiers for factors like terrain or sea invasions. Players can also build forts for defense, and empires can construct monuments by conquering resource-rich lands. At the end of each epoch, players score points for controlling territories, capitals, cities, and monuments. Bonuses are awarded based on presence, dominance, or total control in each region. Players also gain secret bonus points known as pre-eminence markers at the end of each epoch, which are revealed at the end of the game. The player with the highest score after 7 epochs wins. Its concept of scoring regions depending on levels of control was cited by designer Jason Matthews as an inspiration for the scoring mechanism of the hit game Twilight Struggle. It was designed by Ragnar Brothers and originally published in 1991 and featured a board made from a tea towel. It sold out within weeks and was then picked up and published again in English, Dutch, and German versions by various publishers, including Avalon Hill. Hasbro re-released History of the World as a big box game in the early 2000s, and Ragnar Brothers published a revised version in 2009, known as A Brief History of the World, where players played through 6 epochs. Z-Man Games published the most recent version of the game in 2018. In 1994, Robert Waters took over editing The General with Volume 29, Number 3, as Don Hawthorne had to leave the position, citing personal considerations. Hawthorne's historical musings had made the Avalon Hill philosophy section of the General very different in feel and content, but nonetheless interesting. And in Volume 29, Number 5, the first series replay featuring a computer game, Operation Crusader, was presented. Avalon Con, ever part of the company's ongoing attempt to keep board games relevant, was held in August of that year, and was a great success by all accounts. 1994 also brought with it some interesting games, though there weren't many of them. Guerrilla is an intriguing card war game for 3 to 6 players, wherein everyone is vying for control of the government in a civil war. Each player controls the forces of both the government and guerrillas, of which they secretly support only one. Each is given 2 actions per turn to deploy, withdraw, attack, draw cards, etc. in their effort to score points for their side, themselves, or their allies. Since the roles are secret, you can't be sure who is an ally and who is an enemy, which leads to plenty of fog of war and shifting loyalties. There is some luck involved, but it is relatively fast playing with little downtime, and the game has its fans. It was remade and rethemed as combat soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge in 2004 by Lost Battalion Games. Colonial Diplomacy is a standalone variant of the classic Diplomacy. In this game, players take the roles of different colonial powers, vying to control the most colonies and territory. It plays just like the standard game with a few small variations, but with a larger map than the original, different geography, and controversial play balance. Apparently France is really difficult to play, while England seems to have an easier time of it. However, this can always be mitigated with skillful maneuvering and, of course, diplomacy. Roads to Gettysburg is the third game in Avalon Hill's Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series, covering the 3-week campaign leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg. Unlike most Civil War games focused on specific battles, this one explores the broader campaign, with the Union aiming to push Confederate forces back to Virginia and the Confederates aiming to hold the agriculturally rich Pennsylvania. The game is accessible, with some scenarios playable in about an hour. It features 2 detailed and eye-catching maps of 1863 Maryland and Pennsylvania, drawn from historical sources showcasing roads, railways, and other terrain. Each turn represents a day, with players controlling Union and Confederate forces in an interactive initiative system that keeps scenarios unpredictable and competitive. An extensive historical article is included that provides some additional context of the campaign, but the lack of fog of war in the game makes it less valuable as a simulation. Although it's a standalone game, Roads to Gettysburg can be combined with Stonewall Jackson's Way and Here Come the Rebels to cover the Eastern Theater from Fredericksburg to Harrisburg. Maharaja is a board game inspired by the game Britannia, adapting its system to the Indian subcontinent and covering historical events from the Aryan invasions around 1500 BC to the British Raj in the mid-1800s. The game's map spans from the Himalayas to Sri Lanka, capturing a broad sweep of Indian history across centuries. If one likes Britannia, one would also likely enjoy Maharaja, as it is essentially the same game system. The aesthetics are generally good, and it works reasonably well as an overview of Indian history, though there are some balance issues and deterministic victory conditions that take away from the gameplay. The game was also republished in French as Maharaja by Descartes, with updated box art. Palpable in the General 1995 was a sense of unease in the growing rivalry between the declining side of the company that loved board games and the ascendant computer game side. And judging by the letters section, there were more than a few readers who appreciated the gentle transition the General was making from cardboard to digital. At this time, however, Robert Waters decided to leave as editor of the General for personal reasons. His tenure had been quite short, and Stuart Tucker took his place with Volume 30, Number 4, and stayed at the helm until the magazine ceased publication in 1998. Designers Mark Simonich and Ben Knight also joined the Avalon Hill design team in 1995, which was a helpful injection of talent. Change was also afoot higher up. The board of directors of Monarch Avalon, Avalon Hill's parent company, grew by 2 new members. One of these was a longtime Republican Congresswoman, Helen Delic Bentley, and the other was none other than best-selling author Tom Clancy. Sadly, on April 23rd, Avalon Hill was the victim of a burglary. Many discs and tapes were stolen, including the records for the venerable area rating system, which helped to track and enforce competitive play of those who played by mail. This meant that the program had to be shut down, as it was impossible to reconstitute. After almost 20 years of connecting players in a gaming genre where opponents were uncommon, it felt like the loss of an institution. In better news, Avalon Con 95 was yet another resounding success. While the General reduced its coverage of the convention overall, they included a page celebrating the winners of the youth tournaments, which was a nice addition. The game releases that year were quite varied. Empire of the Rising Sun is a Pacific War wargame designed by Bruce Harper with significant contributions from Dave Casper on naval warfare rules. It serves as a companion to Advanced Third Reich, sharing similar mechanics. The game also includes a copy of Ultra Magazine, providing a synopsis of the game. A previous version, which had been mentioned occasionally in the General magazine, had been in development since the 1970s, but had never been published. Milk Caps, also known as Pogs, is a children's game involving flat cardboard caps, and had originally been published in 1920. Players stack the caps and take turns using a heavier slammer to disrupt the stack. Face-up caps are kept by the player, while face-down caps are restacked for further turns. The player with the most caps at the end wins. Popularized and sold commercially in the 1990s, the game's name comes from the Pog Juice brand, whose caps were originally used before it was officially published. The game is now in the public domain. Geronimo is a strategic simulation of a tragic historical period marked by conflict between Native Americans and the United States. Players are randomly assigned roles each turn, either as the US or as various Native American tribes. The US player aims to expand and develop resources such as settlements, towns, and infrastructure to earn victory points by converting territories into states with their limited forces. Meanwhile, Native American players act as guerrillas, aiming to earn victory points by disrupting US plans and denying them their objectives, while avoiding casualties that could lead to devastating consequences like being forced onto reservations or even extinction, which penalizes them in victory points. The game is quite lengthy, fiddly, and likely unbalanced, as the US is very powerful, and it seems like the player who draws it to play the most will be the odds-on favorite to win the game. Stonewall in the Valley is a strategic board game that focuses on the Shenandoah Valley campaign during the American Civil War from March to June 1862. Unlike other Civil War games that typically cover individual battles, this game zooms out to focus on the entire campaign. Players take on the roles of Union and Confederate forces. The Union aims to control key regions in the valley, while the Confederates strive to push them out. The game features relatively easy-to-learn rules and offers several scenarios playable within an hour each. It includes 3 hand-painted maps based on original Civil War period maps of the Shenandoah Valley, depicting detailed topographical features crucial for military operations like roads, railroads, and mountains. Turns represent 1 day of real-time operations, ensuring unpredictability and competitiveness in each scenario. An extensive historical article accompanies the game, providing context on the real campaign's day-to-day activities. While it's part of a series, owning previous volumes isn't necessary. However, players can integrate maps from earlier games, like Stonewall Jackson's Way, Here Come the Rebels, and Roads to Gettysburg, to expand the game's coverage of the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. Editor Stuart Tucker began 1996 with an apology to the readers of the General, as there had only been a handful of issues released over the previous 2 years. However, he said that the General magazine was otherwise generally working fine, and that a little fine-tuning and open-minded thinking would help to steer the magazine going forward, with a focus on fun and competition, balanced between a wide variety of games. Once again, the aging of the hobby comes up in his self-introduction. This magazine must help overcome the aging of the hobby, he proclaimed. He went on to say that early returns of the reader survey show a significant number of aging readers who joined this hobby and subscribed to this magazine in their teens. This magazine should not grow old and die with them. Instead, it should serve to gather into the hobby new blood, the teens of today, while still providing the old guard with new variants and scenarios for their favorite games. Sadly, he wouldn't have a long time to bring that vision to fruition. The founder of Avalon Hill, Charles S. Roberts, and the company's computer game Operation Crusader were featured in an article in the February 3, 1996 issue of London's Daily Telegraph, who said that Avalon Hill games are well-researched, authentic, and will appeal to history buffs. There were some exciting new games to celebrate in 1996. Age of Renaissance is something of a sequel to Civilization designed by Don Greenwood and Jared Scarborough. It is for 3 to 6 players and should take between 2 to 6 hours to play. In this iteration of a civilization builder, players develop their cultures between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, earning points through technological and cultural advances while managing and limiting the misery their culture experiences. Gameplay features a dynamic and arguably chaotic card system, which introduces elements like events, payouts, and famous leaders, creating tremendous variability. The payout mechanic rewards resource sets, similar to Civilization. A streamlined but luck-based combat system adds depth, resolving battles for control over provinces and resources. There is also a strong economic element in this game, where one's empire is expanded in order to increase income and commodities. Despite the tumultuous nature of the game, long playtime, and reportedly subpar components, as well as an inadequate rulebook with some unintuitive elements, the game is fun, allowing players to build their own civilization using some clever game mechanisms. Air Baron is a curious mix of business game, economic simulation, and strategic wargame. The game is set in the aviation industry, focusing on airlines competing for dominance over American airspace. Players alternate turns where they choose between making investments or entering into fare wars. In fare wars, players pay and roll dice to gain control of spokes leading to major city hubs. Income is generated through randomly drawing purchased spokes and controlling hubs. The goal is for a player without outstanding loans to achieve a combination of market share and cash that meets or exceeds the winning target, which varies based on the number of players. The game is apparently best with 3 to 5 players and is quite a fun, competitive game. Kampfgruppe Peiper 2 is the third historical module for Advanced Squad Leader, focusing on the destruction of the German SS during the Battle of the Bulge. It includes 3 historically accurate 23 by 31 map sheets, 2 of which combine for a larger map and 1 standalone map, 6 scenarios, and a campaign game. To play, you need Advanced Squad Leader, Beyond Valor, Yanks, and Kampfgruppe Peiper 1. London's Burning is a solo game that puts the players in the shoes of the RAF during the Battle of Britain. It works on a very small scale, with 2 British fighters going up against waves of 3 to 6 German bombers in an attempt to defend their patch of southwest England. The game combines tactical and operational elements to simulate the intense air battles of the time. Success is measured in defending vital targets like airfields, radar stations, shipping, and London itself from those pesky bombers. In the 2-player mode, one player controls the RAF fighters while the other plans daily raids as the German Luftwaffe. Alternatively, players can team up to cooperatively face off against the game-controlled German Air Force, striving for the highest score. Players can choose from scenarios lasting 6, 25, or 34 days, with game sessions ranging from 2 to 8 hours, offering different levels of challenge and depth in recreating this critical chapter of history. Acclaimed designer Ted S. Racer commented that London's Burning has a lot more going for it as a wargame than just its subject matter. It is one of the most multifaceted and imaginative game designs in the 50-year history of commercial wargaming. It provides real insight into the historical events it portrays. And, oh yes, it is also a great deal of fun to play. Stonewall's Last Battle, the Chancellorsville Campaign, is a strategic board game that allows players to recreate the pivotal campaign from the American Civil War. Players can experience the entire thing, starting from fighting Joe Hooker's daring flank march across the Rappahannock River to the climactic battles around Chancellorsville. The game features a meticulously rendered map of central Virginia, encompassing key locations like the Wilderness, Fredericksburg, and stretches of the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers. This mapboard is based on authentic Civil War maps preserved in state and county archives, enhancing historical accuracy and immersion for players. This one doesn't have the space for maneuver of other games in the series, and due to the victory conditions, the Union player will likely be using a similar battle plan each time, but it plays quickly and is quite fun. Hannibal, Rome vs. Carthage is a strategic, card-driven board game designed by Mark Simonich, focusing on the ancient conflict between Rome and Carthage around 200 BC. It employs an asymmetrical gameplay style where each player takes on the role of either Hannibal's Carthaginian forces or the Roman Republic. Players utilize strategy cards for various actions such as moving generals, recruiting troops, reinforcing armies, gaining political control over provinces, and triggering historical events. When armies clash, battle cards are employed to determine the outcome. Victory hinges on achieving dominance in both military engagements and political control. This is the first game to use the event or operations points mechanic that has become prevalent in many card-driven games, and it really demonstrated the amount of historical flavor and depth these types of games can deliver. The battle cards also add an interesting tactical dimension in which a smaller force can sometimes defeat a larger one. It is a tense and exciting game, a seminal work, though there are some complaints that it can be swingy and luck can greatly affect the outcome sometimes. The game's 20th anniversary saw the release of a revised and expanded edition titled Hannibal and Hamilcar, which reintegrates Hannibal Rome vs. Carthage along with the Hamilcar First Punic War expansion, offering enhanced gameplay and updated components. In 1997's Volume 30, Number 5 of the General, editor Stuart Tucker used some reader surveys to profile a typical Avalon Hill gamer. Based on those results, the average Avalon Hill gamer at the time was 38 years old, male, with 2 kids, if he has any, and has been playing TAHGC games since his teenage years. He subscribes to 1.2 other gaming magazines, owns a computer, splits his game spending evenly between board games and computer games, rarely plays collectible card or role-playing games, devotes about 4 hours per sitting to a game, and spends 1/3 of his playing time at the computer. His favorite topic, without question, is World War II. A distant second, but still popular, is the American Civil War. He shows some interest in buying modern warfare, Napoleonic, ancient, and other 20th century warfare games. He has only mild interest in the 17th to 19th centuries, medieval, science fiction, and family games. He shows almost no interest in fantasy games, and low interest in sports, economics, and politics. After breaking down the difference between the average gamer and their kids in some detail, he offers hope for the future, albeit with the usual warning about the hobby aging out. I am struck by how games like Dinosaurs of the Lost World, Magic, and History of the World appeal to the young without losing the interest of adults. While Doom, Mortal Kombat, and Nintendo games in general have a great appeal for the 15 to 24-year-olds, they in no way spell the death of strategy gaming. The successes of recent war games for computers hold out hope that more studious players exist for both the board game and computer markets. The drift from baseball card collecting to collectible games, emphasis on a game that can be played, shows that our culture, far from deadening the minds of our young, is providing products that allow their creative juices to flow into new avenues. In sum, the splintering of strategy gaming into diverse subject matters and modes of play shows the strength of our consumer-led economy. No single company can dominate the field like Avalon Hill once did in the 1960s. However, with rising incomes to fuel spending on leisure activities, the kids of the future will be demanding more and better strategy games than they did in the past. Manufacturers will have to pay attention to playability and teachability, because there are too many games in town for poorly edited, overly long, mammoth games once prevalent in the hobby to get the attention of the mainstream new gamer of the next century. Around this time, the General's letters section was lively, filled with grognards complaining about the range of games being covered and proclaiming that the General should primarily be covering war games, enthusiastic readers who are enjoying the coverage of games by other game companies, discussion as to how many new games should be covered versus the classics, the extent of Avalon Con coverage, and the perennial digital versus cardboard debate. It seemed impossible to find a middle ground where everyone could be happy. In Volume 31, Issue 5, a new column, Zone of Control, was launched, which reviewed both Avalon Hill games and games by other publishers, beginning with Gina from Clash of Arms Games. This was quite a break from tradition, as the General had featured Avalon Hill games to that point, but the effort was being made to make the General more of an industry magazine. The column was quite well received if the letters section is anything to go by. There's an interesting reference in Volume 31, Number 6 to a new company, Rio Grande Games, who will be publishing in 1998 English language versions of Medici and El Grande, two popular German games. Of course, Rio Grande would go on to become one of the major publishers in the board gaming hobby. Avalon Con was held again that summer from July 30th to August 3rd, and by now it was running pretty smoothly. The letters to the editor after the event testified to the fun that was had. There weren't a lot of games released in 1997, but they were quite varied. Starship Troopers Prepare for Battle is a tactical wargame distinct from Avalon Hill's earlier Starship Troopers game, which was released in 1976 and based on Robert Heinlein's novel. Instead, Prepare for Battle draws its theme and setting from the 1997 film adaptation of Starship Troopers rather than the book. Unlike its predecessor, which featured more complex strategy and detailed wargame mechanics, Prepare for Battle emphasizes fast-paced, scenario-driven gameplay. Players start with a set of basic rules that gradually expand in complexity as they progress through different scenarios, each introducing new tactical elements and mechanisms. The modular rule approach makes it easy for players to get started and adds variety as the game evolves. While respected now, the film was quite controversial at the time, but for those who rose above that fray, this game offers a fun and fast introductory experience to attract a younger crowd of gamers. Its programmed instruction rulebook allows players to get up and running in minutes. Atlantic Storm is a trick-taking game set during World War II, where players represent units attacking or defending Allied convoys in the North Atlantic. Each round, the lead player selects a convoy route in either the Arctic or Atlantic, and year between 1940 and 1943, then declares the battle environment of either air, surface, or underwater. Players then play appropriate units from either the German or Allied side. After all players make their selections, there may be some dice rolls and players determine the battle's outcome. The player who contributed most to the winning side decides the distribution of victory points from convoys and enemy ships. After 20 rounds, the player with the most victory points wins. It's apparently a great filler game with any downtime between turns filled with negotiations and trash talk. Stock Market Guru is a revised version of Stocks and Bonds designed to better simulate the stock market. Players trade stocks in 10 companies over 10 turns, aiming to amass the most money by the game's end. The game includes 3 historical scenarios: the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, the late 80s uncertain boom, and the 70s oil crises and inflation, allowing players to recreate these distinct periods in investment history. Doomed Battalions was the last module for Advanced Squad Leader released by Avalon Hill. It dealt with the so-called minor participants in World War II like Holland, Belgium, Norway, Poland, and Greece. While the infantry is quite generic, the module represents artillery and tanks in excruciating detail. If players are interested in the battles of the early war, this module is quite fun and interesting, with the new nationalities providing quite a different feel. In Princess Ryan's Star Marines, the villain Dar Yamaguchi kidnaps Princess Ryan, and a group of low-ranking Star Marines must rescue her before she is executed. Players work together as a semi-cooperative team, facing continuous threats. After each contest, the top performer earns rewards that could provide clues to the princess's location. The player who identifies her whereabouts first is declared the winner, provided the team reaches the castle in time. The Princess Ryan of the title is named after designer Mark McLaughlin's daughter, and it is Star Marines after Games Workshop apparently took umbrage to the use of Space Marines early in the design. It reportedly gets a bit repetitive after a while, however, and though it has some good ideas, it isn't a top-tier game. Successors is a card-driven wargame inspired by We the People and Hannibal, Rome vs. Carthage, with the addition of a multiplayer element. Players assume the roles of generals under the recently deceased Alexander the Great, reenacting the civil war in the Hellenistic Middle East. The game features a point-to-point map system, large colorful counters, and a unique deck of cards that adds a fresh twist to traditional wargames. There's a neat mechanism in this game where the leader in victory points in a given turn is labeled the usurper, and other players may all attack said usurper and vice versa without any penalty that would otherwise apply to fighting amongst each other. This is an ingrained bash the leader rule. It has been re-implemented in 2008 as Successors: The Battles for Alexander's Empire by GMT Games. Titan the Arena is a strategic card game for 2 to 5 players, where participants act as spectators betting on fantasy creatures fighting in an arena. Each round, one creature dies based on the lowest power card played in front of them. Players place bets and use strategic diplomacy with the numbered power cards. Betting allows players to sometimes use a creature's special power in battle. The victor is the player with the most winnings at the end of the game. Titan the Arena is a reworking of Reiner Knizia's Grand National Derby, with significant gameplay changes by Avalon Hill. Despite the similar name, it is not closely related to the game Titan beyond the fantasy creature theme. It was later republished by Fantasy Flight Games under the title Colossal Arena in 2004. More recently, a reimagining of the game was published in 2021 by Plan B Games under the title Equinox. 1998 was the last fateful year of the Avalon Hill Game Company. Indeed, there were some signs of decline, such as some older classic games being discontinued. Candidate, Luftwaffe, Stock Market, Stocks and Bonds, Superstar Baseball, and Thunder at Casino. But contrary to what one might expect, there were signs of expansion, or at least business as usual, at that time. That year, Avalon Hill acquired the worldwide publishing rights to the TAC Ops computer game system of Major I.L. Holdridge. TAC Ops was focused on contemporary and near-future tactical level operations and had a no-nonsense user interface, which allegedly appealed to the military market. Also, the always much-anticipated Avalon Con was scheduled between July 29th and August 2nd of 1998. There were only a handful of games released that final year. Bitter Woods: The Battle of the Bulge is a mid-complexity two-player wargame that focuses on the famous battle of the same name, which occurred in December 1944 and was the last major German offensive of World War II. The game map represents the Ardennes region, featuring roads, rivers, and cities, with a hexagonal grid where each hexagon covers 2 miles. Units are represented by brigades and regiments, and each turn equals 12 hours of real time. Key features of the game include morale, notable leaders, blitzkrieg tactics, German army boundaries, mechanisms recreating the initial surprise the German side created, and the decisive nature of Allied air power. The game components consist of a 22-inch by 32-inch unmounted map, 320 counters, and a 16-page rulebook. It was the 4th game covering this battle that was published by Avalon Hill, and the last World War II game published by the company. It can be viewed in some ways as a culmination of the wargaming hobby. While it features the typical hexes, counters, and zones of control, it introduces an unconventional combat results table and makes all the chrome of the system optional, so players can customize their experience. Overall, it is a well-made, interesting, and comfortably familiar game. Monsters Ravage America is an interesting choice as one of Avalon Hill's final releases. Players control one of 6 giant monsters rampaging across a map of the USA, destroying cities, crushing famous landmarks, and battling opponents. Monsters range from classic types like giant lizards and apes to unconventional ones like massive glowworms, each with unique abilities. Players also command a branch of the military which can attack and hinder other monsters, though the militia forces will likely be ultimately overwhelmed as monsters destroy bases and reduce available troops. The game builds to a climactic showdown after 20 cities are destroyed, triggering a final monster challenge where all monsters battle in a free-for-all. The last monster standing wins. This game was later remade as Monsters Menace America by Wizards of the Coast. This new edition was released in 2005 with some streamlined rules and drastically improved aesthetics from the original game, adding plastic monsters and military units. On to Richmond is the 6th game in the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series, focusing on the Peninsula Campaign. Players control Union and Confederate forces in a strategy and maneuver game, with each turn representing 1 day of real time. The game features a map based on Civil War period maps, with each hexagon representing about 2,000 yards. 8 scenarios are provided, from the entire campaign, which lasts 112 turns, to short cavalry raids playable in 15 to 30 minutes. The game features a beautiful map board and components, but the real strength is the game system, which has straightforward rules overall, though with some very specific exceptions here and there, is easy to learn, and yet gives a solidly detailed feel for warfare at the time of the Civil War. The scenarios are engaging and very playable as well, being nicely varied as to complexity and time to play. The main downside is that the hexes can become crowded, but that is certainly not a problem unique to this wargame. As the 90s progressed, a noticeable decline had been accelerating. 1997 and 1998 in particular resulted in huge losses for both the board and computer gaming divisions of the company. The gaming division lost almost $1.5 million in 1998, and the computer game division declined by 61% and over $1 million in sales that same year. For every dollar spent to make a game, only 66 cents was being earned in return. This was all further compounded by lawsuits. In fact, the Avalon Hill bestseller Civilization was at the center of this. To recap, Francis Tresham designed it in 1980, and Avalon Hill got the US license in 1981. After a decade of great sales, Advanced Civilization came out in 1992. When the company announced their shift to computer games in 1994, Civilization was at the top of the list for a digital adaptation, which happened in 1995. And in April of 1997, Avalon Hill announced that Activision would produce a new version. The problem was that another computer game company, Microprose, had a product called Sid Meier's Civilization that was also quite popular, and they voiced their opposition to this plan. In November 1997, Microprose was sued by Avalon Hill and Activision for copyright infringement related to the name Civilization, looking to secure the copyright to the name. In an epic response, Microprose went out on December 7, 1997, and acquired Heartland Trefoil, the original publisher of the game, an acquisition which included Francis Tresham himself, all the rights to Civilization, and also, as a bonus, the 1829 Railroad game system that was also a decent seller for Avalon Hill, whose licenses were then immediately ended. Microprose then countersued Avalon Hill and Activision for trademark infringement and unfair business practices. On July 14, 1998, Avalon Hill gave in and made a payment of $411,000, along with officially turning the sole ownership of the rights to Civilization over to Microprose. The consolation prize was that Avalon Hill was allowed to sell off their remaining inventory, but nothing beyond that. In the end, Activision was still given the rights to produce the game, which was later titled Civilization: Call to Power. Simultaneously, this legal drama was going on just as Hasbro was negotiating the acquisition of both Avalon Hill and Microprose. Without the sales of the popular Civilization in 1830, things were not going to get better. In fact, Monarch Avalon had been facing some financial pressure long before. Wargames had been in decline through the 1980s, and Avalon Hill's attempts to diversify into other gaming genres had met with mixed success. As far back as 1990, the company had been forced to close its New York office and to sell off its toy division while reducing inventory due to 3 years of tough financial circumstances. Eric Dott, the longtime president of the company and chairman of Monarch, also admitted that the company had been on the block in 1995 as well, but was taken off the market for revamping. Eventually, it all became too much. Dott made the fateful and likely quick and easy decision that Monarch Avalon Incorporated was to sell its entire line of games to Hasbro for $6 million in the summer of 1998. To be precise, Dott sold the rights to all Avalon Hill titles, all back stock, and even the company name to Hasbro. This included Victory Games, all Avalon Hill software, and all trademarks, copyrights, and tooling. After 36 years, Monarch Avalon, which had changed its name years ago from Monarch Printing, was now forced to change its name again to Monarch Services Incorporated. The printing business, Monarch Envelope, and Girls Life magazine, published in conjunction with the Girl Scouts of America, remained. John G. Taylor, an analyst for an investment company out of Portland, Oregon, that specializes in games and toys, said that the purchase was a good move for Hasbro. "I suspect Hasbro has pretty big plans for this company," he said. "By taking the established brand name games of Avalon Hill and integrating them into interactive games for personal computers, Hasbro stands to do well." He also added, "With Avalon Hill, they are picking up strong brands in the strategy category. These games are the most popular in the interactive PC category. There's no speed, action, or movement. There is just strategy. People who play games on PCs like those type of games." Hasbro, based in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, had previously bought out many toy and game companies, such as Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley. It is famous as the producer of toys and games such as Mr. Potato Head, Monopoly, Candyland, and Clue. Dot refused to discuss why the game unit of this company was sold, simply saying, "Hasbro wanted to buy it, so we took the offer. We haven't decided what our next move will be yet." All the employees were terminated. In an interview with J.C. Connors, who was hired for a design role by Avalon Hill in 1996, he spoke about the final moments of the company, where he was one of a half-dozen employees to leave the office that day for the last time. The staff remaining at the company by that time was quite small, and they had been doing the best they could with the people and the resources that were given them. But there had long been a feeling of frustration among them that it was harder and harder to get things greenlit, and the resources afforded them were not sufficient. Connors claimed that he had done the art for Monsters Ravage America because there was no budget to pay an actual artist. "If I didn't do them, the game wouldn't have had any art," he said. Connors, who had been responsible for running the website and blog for the company, wanted to put the word out. The last statement made on the official website on August 4th, 1998 was simply, "Avalon Hill has officially been sold to Hasbro. All employees of Avalon Hill were terminated as of today. What does this mean for Avalon Hill? We don't know. Thanks to everyone at Avalon Con who showed us how great this hobby is, and thanks to all the loyal fans who have supported the Avalon Hill Game Company for 3 decades. Really, we mean that." Dot was furious about that statement being released, and it was taken down almost immediately. But in the end, it had been seen, it stated the truth, and at that point, it didn't really matter. The sale was soon confirmed by Hasbro, Monarch Avalon, and others, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. It was producer-director of software development and trained electrical engineer Bill LeVay who was the final person to leave the building as Avalon Hill's last employee. He had only been employed with Avalon Hill for 3 years and 3 months at the time, having been working beforehand for the Department of Defense. In an article he wrote in the aftermath called A Eulogy for Avalon Hill, LeVay wrote, "I never imagined 31 years ago that I would be the one turning out the lights here. It is not something that I am proud of. I am so very sad, and I can't even say that I lost my job, at least not yet." LeVay had been retained because of his technical background and moved to Monarch Services and its publication Girls Life to do web design and network services. One can clearly imagine him looking around the building on the last day, his footsteps echoing eerily as he made his way around the empty building until he arrived at the door and the last light switch. With one last thoughtful and sad stare into the now empty space, the light goes off with a click, and there is only darkness. The Avalon Hill Game Company was no more. The General's last issue was Volume 32, Number 3, and there's nothing in its pages to indicate any sense of the company's imminent demise. It featured the American Civil War games Across 5 Aprils and the Civil War, as well as some sports games, Wrastlin' and Title Bout. The last Avalon Hill philosophy article, the longtime voice of the General's editor, was ominously titled, "Who Needs a Game Company?" It doesn't directly address any financial problems the company was having, but it did hint at some of the challenges facing industry in general. Daily, the marketplace challenges manufacturers and distributors to justify their existence. Some haven't answered the call. Some manufacturers have retreated into mail-order businesses, with most evidence pointing to this being a delaying action preceding disappearance. Distributors are contracting. Advertising techniques must adapt to ever-changing methods of communicating with consumers. Interestingly, he extols the benefits of so-called desktop publishing, where an individual designer can self-publish and distribute their work much more flexibly and profitably than before. One could argue that desktop publishing, or DTP, is more adaptive to consumer concerns than a traditional game company. After all, without any inventory, the DTP designer can quickly alter game content for the next sale. Without taking a financial bath for a failure, the DTP designer can fiddle to find what works with far less at risk. Furthermore, the ease of publication may allow far more titles into print than possible through traditional manufacturers. This in itself will satisfy the arcane niches of consumer interest to no end. He then details the limitations of DTP. In the end, he concludes that a proper game company is needed to ensure quality of product, and so games can reach the public broadly, and that the main beneficiary is the consumer. The irony is that that is essentially how Avalon Hill began with Charles Roberts 45 years previously. One interesting footnote is that there is an announcement in the Infiltrators report at the end of the final issue that says, Paths of Glory Ted Racer's strategic-level World War I game has been sold to the Avalon Hill Game Company. Expect release in less than a year. Of course, Paths of Glory was picked up and eventually published by GMT Games in 1999.
Paths of Glory was originally going to be for Avalon Hill.
Yes.
They took it in the very last issue of the General. There is a sentence on upcoming games listing Paths of Glory, but the very week that came out, they sold Avalon Hill and fortunately GMT existed, or Paths of Glory probably would have been the end of it right there.
Also, there is mention of some interesting advanced squad leader modules in the works, including the final installment of the World War II Orders of Battle, the Axis Minor Vehicles and Ordnance, which would have been called Armies of Oblivion, an historical ASL module named A Bridge Too Far, based on the British defense of Arnhem, and another called Blood Reef Tarawa. Apparently, Hasbro did consider having Wizards of the Coast operate the General magazine, but there wasn't enough of a business case to let it continue. Stuart Tucker went on to become editor of GMT Games' C3I magazine instead. Multiman Publishing essentially took on the legacy of the General magazine in their publication commonly known as Operations. In the fall of 2004, Multiman Publishing described Operations as follows. The content of the magazine will slowly evolve to include other MMP games and will eventually become to MMP what the General was to the Avalon Hill Game Company. Although Operations magazine officially ended in 2010, it was replaced with Special Ops in 2011, which is around 40 pages long and is published semi-annually. It has articles about and scenarios for Multiman Publishing's games, and even provides some complete games in its pages. Avalon Hill later operated as a division of Wizards of the Coast, which was acquired in September 1999 by Hasbro. On September 8, 2020, Hasbro announced that it would move the management of Avalon Hill from Wizards of the Coast to Hasbro Gaming in January 2021. Games are still released under the Avalon Hill banner, like Risk 2210 AD, Axis and Allies, Robo Rally, and Betrayal at House on the Hill, though the original company had nothing to do with these designs. The brand still resonates with some measurable effect, though it is mostly limited to baby boomers and Gen Xers. And some Avalon Hill games survive, albeit in modified form, to this day. On January 15, 1999, Multiman Publishing, which had been founded only 5 years earlier, announced an exclusive association with Hasbro to develop, produce, and distribute games and other products for Avalon Hill's advanced squad leader system. MMP made many changes, as the decision was made not to reprint the earlier squad leader games, which meant that many ASL core modules had to be reorganized to include boards from the earlier games, which, if you will recall, were necessary to play the core scenarios of Advanced Squad Leader. In addition, a website sprung up in 1996 to play Advanced Squad Leader online with other players. It was Virtual Advanced Squad Leader, shortened to VASL, which eventually became Vassal in 2002. It now supports gameplay of hundreds of games, including many Avalon Hill titles. Multiman Publishing also acquired the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series, and more materials for these games have been published over the years. The rights to many of Avalon Hill's more complex games have been licensed or sold to other game publishers, or have reverted to their original owners and been republished by other companies. Valley Games has published new versions of the classic games Titan, Hannibal Rome vs. Carthage, and Republic of Rome. GMT has also picked up the torch, publishing new editions of Successors, For the People, and We the People under a new title, Washington's War. They have also published a descendant of Advanced Third Reich and Empire of the Rising Sun, which is called World at War. Mayfair Games has the rights to 1830, which is one of several so-called 18XX games they publish. Other games have been reimagined and expanded. 2015's Mega Civilization reintroduces a version of the game Advanced Civilization with a 2-meter-long board that allows up to 18 players to trade, fight, and build a civilization in a grander manner than ever before. This was later split into more manageable halves, Mega Empires the West and Mega Empires the East. And computer versions of old games can be found, such as Close Combat, a digital implementation of Advanced Squad Leader, which is published by none other than Atomic Games, and which had its last iteration as late as 2019. In summary, what led to the fall of Avalon Hill? A combination of factors. First of all, computer games took a lot of the attention of younger gamers away, being a shinier, more accessible interface in which the firm tried but failed to establish itself. Second, it was partly a victim of a boom and bust cycle and was caught at the bottom of it with declining sales and additional legal costs due to the battle over civilization. The 80s and 90s were tough on a lot of game and toy companies, where profit margins are narrow at the best of times, as even the great Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley were victims of this era of mergers and acquisitions. Third, there was likely too much attention paid to complex niche games like Advanced Squad Leader that would never have caught on with the mass market. So what, in the end, is Avalon Hill's legacy? It is hard to quantify. Avalon Hill was an institution of sorts, a torchbearer for an entire hobby for many decades. LeVay hinted at something in his article. The saddest thing, to me, will be that this exceptional team is now going to be scattered to the four winds. It's hard to convey the sense of camaraderie that we had together. You should have been there. The best I can come to describe it is the closeness you see at AvalonCon between people from all walks of life that are bonded by the love of our games. As this series has progressed, there is a phrase that has been used countless times in the comments and feedback. Great memories. Memories of time spent with family, with friends, at conventions, and even playing solitaire. That a company created experiences with paper, cardboard, and some plastic that have left untold numbers of people with great memories. I think that is the legacy. I'm sure that the founder, Charles S. Roberts, would be proud. Thank you for watching. If you have stuck with me through this entire series, I not only thank you but commend you. It has been a labor of love, and if it was of value to you, please like, subscribe, or even consider becoming a member to help our channel out. Finally, I would encourage you to, whenever possible, fight the cult of the new. Play these old games, keep them alive, and share them with others. The games produced by Avalon Hill are too good to disappear into the mists of history. But those of us who loved the company's games when they were around are the only ones who can keep their memory alive, and must take the responsibility of passing the great legacy of the Avalon Hill Game Company to new generations. This is Legendary Tactics.